Hi students, as I explained in my last video, as we come to the end of the Mexican-American War, we have the two paths or two aspects of United States history that are in a collision course with one another. The growing territorial expansion of the United States, especially after the Mexican-American War, and growing opposition to slavery and the growing influence of the abolitionist movement in the northern United States. And we see these trends coming to a head, coming into conflict for the first time in the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. And this was a bill that was put forward by a Democratic congressman, but one from a free state from Pennsylvania, in which he proposed that the state of Texas should be admitted as a free state, but that in the other territories that had become part of the United States after the Mexican-American War, slavery should be prohibited. And in making this argument, he was appealing to what had become recognized as sort of the standard American government position on slavery in recent decades. And that was that Congress did not have the right or did not have the precedent to legislate on whether slavery was legal in the states. That was a decision that should be left up to the states. But that in the territories, the United States Congress did have the authority to determine whether slavery should be legal or not. And so that's basically what Wilmot is saying. He's saying in Texas, you have a state, it's got slavery, therefore that's okay. But in these other territories, we're going to ban slavery. And he had some significant popular support for this. But it's not all because his supporters are opposed to slavery. This is something that it's important to remember. The abolitionist movement is definitely opposed to slavery, but a lot of their allies are not per se opposed to slavery, but they share some of the abolitionist goals. Or at least some of what the abolitionists are trying to do works for their goals. And so you have people who are in favor of the Wilmot Proviso, what Wilmot's proposing here, not because they're opposed to slavery, but because actually for racist reasons, they don't want any African Americans in the western territories of the United States, even as slaves. They want these to be territories that are occupied mostly by white American farmers, and even as slaves, they want to keep African Americans out of those territories. So they're opposed to the spread of slavery, but not because they think slavery is bad. And there are others who are opposed because they want to raise tariffs. Remember, this was also a dividing line. The industrial North wanted to raise tariffs on imported products. Why? Because it meant that they could sell what they were producing for higher prices and make more money, whereas the South didn't want this. And so some people supported the Wilmot Proviso as a way of limiting the spread of a southern bloc that farmed cotton that was opposed to tariffs, which would mean that their power and influence to raise tariffs and make more money was strengthened. So not all of Wilmot's supporters are supporting him because they're opposed to slavery. And it's important to recognize this is a trend. It's going to be a trend throughout this chapter, throughout this week, and the next one. Nevertheless, in the Senate, Wilmot's proposal is defeated, and the president at the time, President Polk, is also opposed to it. The alternative approach that's proposed by people who are more okay with slavery is proposed by a governor of Michigan whose last name was Cass. And Cass proposed the popular sovereignty approach. Congress isn't going to legislate on this. Those who are within the territory, those who are within the state, can choose whether or not they own slaves. Not even the states are going to decide on it, but it's just popular sovereignty. People will decide for themselves. Now, of course, what's the problem for this? The problem is that, of course, African Americans, slaves, aren't deciding whether they get to be slaves or not, or whether they want to be slaves or not. Basically, slave owners or wealthy individuals are deciding whether or not they want to enslave other people. But this is the other proposal that's kind of on the table. And these two approaches, the Wilmot approach, restricting slavery in the territories, and the Cass approach, allowing individuals within these territories to decide. These are going to basically frame the debate. And this debate comes to a head the year after that, or about 2 years after that, when the gold rush begins in California. And you have this huge rush of people who are trying to get to California to take advantage of the gold that's been discovered there. And California quickly reaches the threshold that's necessary to apply for statehood, as does the state of New Mexico. And both apply to be admitted into the Union as free states. And Zachary Taylor, who's the president at the time, who was a Southern slaveholder, so this surprised many Southern slaveholders, was also an expansionist and so supported the admitting of California and New Mexico, even if they were going to be admitted as free states. So the South was deeply opposed to this. They saw this as the beginnings of the balance tipping away from states where slavery was permitted, especially as these states reach into the South, especially as the state of New Mexico borders on a slave state of Texas. And so they were opposed to this. You have a logjam, and so this is going to lead to the Compromise of 1850. And this is basically the swan song for the great political figures that we've been looking at in, I suppose you would say, in the second half of this class. Henry Clay, the great nationalist, John Calhoun, the nationalist who became states' rights activist in South Carolina, and Daniel Webster, great defender of the Union. And Henry Clay is tasked with coming up with a compromise which will enable the southern states to accept California and New Mexico as new states. And this was what he came up with. A number of different provisions. California will be accepted as a free state. New Mexico and Utah territories will not be accepted as states yet. People in those territories will be able to choose whether they are slave or free states. The state of Texas will limit its borders. So the Texans wanted to take over a lot of what is now New Mexico and call it Texas, and that would have expanded areas where slavery was permitted. Clay was opposed to that and was making it up to Texas by then offering to pay the debts of the state of Texas. And so at this point, things have largely gone in favor of those who are in favor of expanding the number of states, limiting slavery in these new states. But then this is the sting in the tail for abolitionists and the way that Clay is trying to get Southerners on board. There's going to be a more effective fugitive slave law, which is going to enable slave owners to recapture slaves who have escaped. And there's going to be a resolution passed which states that which limits Congress's authority or states the limitations of Congress authority to regulate interstate slave trade. And so this is the compromise that Clay has put forward. And everyone opposes it. Well, not everyone, but the extremists on both sides oppose it. Calhoun, even though he was too weak to deliver his own speech himself by this point, opposes it on the grounds, and it's ironic to us today, on the grounds of liberty. Remember philosophy of John Locke. Inalienable rights that must be defended are life, liberty, and property. Calhoun says the slaves are the property of citizens of the United States who live in the southern states. If the Union is going to continue to admit states where the Southerners' rights to that property are not going to be respected, who are going to take away that property, then the southern states will secede. They will have to leave the Union. Calhoun is opposed by Daniel Webster, famous defender of the Union, back from the nullification crisis, and Webster appeals on the grounds of nationalism to the Senate and to the Congress to accept Clay's compromise. And he says, we should accept this because slaves are the property of their owners. Therefore, we should support a fugitive slave law which allows the property to be returned to their rightful owners. And he says at the same time, this threat that the Southerners are making to secede, that's illegitimate. That's not allowed. And so he's trying, kind of like Clay, he's trying to appease both sides here. He's saying, we don't have to condemn slavery on principle, But the southern states have to follow the principles of the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that new states have to accept slavery if they don't want to. And he's decried on both sides as a traitor. Abolitionists see him as a traitor for defending a Fugitive Slave Act. Southerners see him as a traitor for not defending secession, see him as a traitor to the rights of liberty that they saw the United States as founded on. The third famous speech in this debate about the Compromise of 1850 is made by a new senator, William Seward. You know, we've been hearing about Calhoun and Clay and Webster for a long time now, but Seward is a new generation senator from New York, and he's an abolitionist. And he says we should make no compromises with slavery, and that Clay is sinning against a higher law than the law of the Constitution in setting out this compromise. He's sinning against God's law. Therefore, we should reject this compromise, and we should violate, he calls on citizens of the northern states to violate any effort to impose a fugitive slave law. He says we should defy these laws, we should help the slaves to escape. This is the Southerners' worst fears come true. Northern politicians who are going to encourage slaves to flee from the South and who are not going to return. Not quite their worst fears, but pretty close to it. And so this is kind of interesting because you see the different positions laid out here. Remember, nationalism had been what had held the Union together the previous generation. And Clay and Webster still represent that. But at the same time, there are more extreme positions now, held by Calhoun and held by Seward. And these positions are going to be what come to dominate the political discourse and lead to a civil war. In the meantime, the Compromise of 1850 is actually going to get passed. It gets passed partly because President Taylor dies. And Taylor wasn't particularly in favor of this compromise. He just kind of wanted to ram through making California and New Mexico free states. But his vice president, who succeeds him, Millard Fillmore is in favor of the compromise. And he works with another new senator, Stephen Douglas, to get this compromise through the Congress and the Senate. And the way they do this is very interesting. They break it down into separate parts. So rather than everyone having to either vote for or against it, they vote for each one separately. And that enables them to pass the bill.